Story 1. A long time ago, I from India flew to Rome on a professional assignment. It was my first flight and my first time abroad. I expected to mostly show up at work and interact with a few people on one team. I was doing a project for Alitalia where it was common for some subgroup or union to strike, and for the rest of the information technology department to stop work in solidarity. I saw people in the information technology department get up in unison because the pilots union was striking, motioned for me to come along, and we hung out in the cafeteria having coffee while the strike was being resolved. It was a huge shock to see this behavior ingrained in public sector culture in a first world country. But the second culture shock, a really lovely one, was this. I met many people in the cafeteria, not just from the team but others too. They truly embraced me, partly because they probably took pity on me being lonely in a completely alien situation, and partly because I made a genuine effort to learn Italian and read about Roman history. I was invited to many people's houses for dinner, even when some spoke very little English and their families none at all. I learned quickly that saying molto fame, meaning very hungry, was much appreciated. The entire evening was centered around feeding me. I adore Italians. Story 2. I was just in Finland, and the streets in downtown Helsinki are utterly quiet. No honking, engine revving, or outdoor conversation. It is eerie. Story 3. For me, the biggest shock was in Mindanao. I went to the city center to shop and saw a very typical pirated DVD shop. Among the action movies, they had unapologetic child exploitation DVDs with cover artwork and a jacket explaining the content like it was any other movie collection. I couldn't process that this garbage was on display in the center of town as just another title. My best cultural surprise, which I prefer to think about, was Macau. Downtown there is nothing but casinos, pawn shops, and jewelry shops, and the only thing even approaching a normal store is 7-Eleven. Feels like an empty, soulless ghost town. However, if you take a bicycle tour, there are amazing buildings, churches, and things to see. Walking down the side streets away from everything else, they have Portuguese restaurants where the food is fantastic. The restaurants in the five-star hotels were depressing and intimidating, but these little cafe places that aren't advertised serve world-class Portuguese food. We even managed to get lost in the mountains, which I didn't know such a small place would have. The locals sat and chatted with us for hours, even though we could barely communicate, and somehow got us back to town. Absolutely wonderful people. The place that seems soulless is actually overflowing with soul. Story 4. In New Orleans, they have small shacks where you drive up to purchase alcoholic drinks to go. I come from a state that started selling liquor on Sundays about 7 years ago. Story 5. I lived in China for 4 years. Culture shock was definitely a thing. I had a surreal moment early one December while spending the weekend in a fairly small city. I saw a bakery, which there are many of in China, fully decorated with every December holiday decoration you could imagine. Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, and even a Blessed Yule sign. I walked in, and they were playing my mother's favorite Christmas album, Sandy Patty Christmas or something like that. It played non-stop in our house around Christmas during my childhood. I hadn't heard the album in years, but it brought an instant flood of memories in the last place I would have expected. I ended up wandering around the store and bought a couple of egg tarts. The employees probably thought I was drunk or something. Story 6. So, Japan. I knew it would be different, but I did not expect absolute silence on trains during rush hour. It felt like everyone was telepathically agreeing not to exist too loudly. Story 7. My culture shock was kind of the opposite of culture shock. As an Australian who visited New Zealand, I was walking the streets thinking, this could be any city in Australia. I probably should not have found it as strange as I did. But there we are. Story 8. The boat from Spain to Morocco only takes about an hour. Europe and Africa are very different in almost every way. Story 9. I was seconded to a steel mill in Edmonton, Canada for a while. I am Australian. I expected the cold. I expected driving on the left side of the road. I did not expect the yellow school buses on that first Monday going to work. In Australia, ordinary transit buses are normally used for special school services, and I was expecting the same in Canada. My still jet-lagged brain wondered for a moment which country I was in, Canada or the United States. I also was not expecting the use of imperial units in the steel mill. I had previously thought, Canada is a metric country, so at least I will not have to deal with unit confusion over there. Thousandths of an inch and Fahrenheit units gave me a headache. Story 10. Well, I've experienced reverse culture shock twice. India is so chaotic that when I returned to Australia, people stopped at red lights, cars followed road rules, and no one humped unless someone was angry. It took me a day to truly readjust to the Australian way of living. The second time was when I moved back to Australia after living in the United Kingdom for 2 years during winter. I sat on the beach under clear blue skies on an Australian winter day wearing only one jacket, completely amazed because winter in the United Kingdom is unpleasant with constant drizzle. After 2 winters there, I had come to accept the long, dreary period of no blue skies for months and the need to always wear multiple layers. It took me a moment to realize that this is what home feels like. We do have it good in Australia. Story 11. How Wallonia is different from Flanders. The same train announcements changed from only French to bilingual to only Dutch within the span of 1 hour. Story 12. As a German from Switzerland, I always understood when people called Germans distant, unwelcoming, and rude. But then I realized that those people have never been to Switzerland. Story 13. I live in a small country with very diverse dialects. When I moved from my small town to the capital, just 600 kilometers away, I had to completely change the way I speak for people to understand me. Story 14. I was an Australian exchange student in France when I was 16. Kids smoking on the school grounds was a real shock to me, as was the number of kids who rode mopeds to school. Story 15. South Florida felt surprisingly hard to adapt to as a born and bred Midwesterner. Things I considered polite, they considered hostile. I was waiting my turn patiently in my car at a recycling center to pull up and drop off boxes. A woman was there taking her time. I didn't rush her at all and kept my distance. She started screaming at me and told me to go somewhere else and stop rushing her. Okay. A male acquaintance once said, "Girls from here aren't nice unless they want to have sex." Was that like a warning to me? Or something? I was just like, so you don't have friends that are women? I found the impatience, the entitlement, and the culture around appearance, dating, and friendships to be soul-crushing. Very transactional. Anything to get on a boat or be near a boat. Completely opposite of everything I learned to value as a person. I never got used to it and am glad I left. Story 16. I spent a year working in Qatar. I was absolutely expecting culture shock, but I was not expecting it to affect me the way it did or my reaction to it. This is also not something I like to admit because it is deeply problematic. I need to add the heavy caveat here that, as a foreign white national, it did not impact my world the way it would a local woman. I only experienced a small taste of the positive side effects without the many negatives. I really loved the strict gender segregation rules. I worked as a swim teacher at a sports complex. In the morning, I taught small children during the family-only hours, and at night, I taught adult women during the women-only hours. At night, the place went into complete lockdown, and every single staff member had to be female. The clients, many of whom I would see in the morning when I taught their children, transformed into carefree, hilarious extroverts. The whole atmosphere of the place shifted. I have never felt that same level of peace and female camaraderie. There were a few times when I faced the harsh reality of those rules and restrictions and the impact they have on people's lives and freedoms. But I hate how much I miss it. Story 17. How nice people are in the harsh real world. The one my toxic ex-stepdad and strict mom said they were preparing me for. The world must have become less dangerous since the last time they paid attention. The world is tough, but it is nothing compared to my childhood growing up in a tough, toxic bubble. Edit. Or maybe I just got lucky and am in an unusually good place. Story 18. From Southern California. When I stopped at a grocery store in Wyoming on my way to Yellowstone, I was genuinely shocked that the cashier was nice and interested in what we were doing and going to see. Took a minute to realize she actually cared. It was unusual. Story 19. London. I am from the countryside in England and traveled to a few countries between the ages of 18 and 21. I then went to university in London and, since it is in my home country and I had traveled a bit, I did not expect any kind of learning curve to living in London. I was wrong. Story 20. Seeing a bus full of Asian tourists at a gas station in a tiny town in rural Utah was surprising to me. In the Midwest, most small towns do not see many non-white visitors in a year. One minority passing through is the talk of the town in some places. Story 21. Going back to Australia for a visit after years away. The immigration officer gave me the strongest, "How are you going?" Australian accent. It made me realize I used to sound like that when I left Australia for work overseas. Story 22. I am from the United States and was in Italy visiting my girlfriend. My dad, my girlfriend, her parents, and I were all swimming. After the swim, they got out and started to shower in the outdoor shower, naked. My dad and I were dumbfounded, and they were equally surprised that we did not do the same. They said it was perfectly normal there. Story 23. As an American, I was curious about how comfortable Germans are being naked. I had been to nature spas in Germany before, so I was quite aware and pretty comfortable myself. One time, I had a massage scheduled at a highly regarded naturist wellness spa. My massage therapist that day was male, and I am normally used to the therapist, male or female, leaving the room while you get changed or take your top off and get on the table. However, I was already in a bikini since it was a spa, and I was purposefully fidgeting with my top while he was still in the room chatting with me, thinking he would step out for a moment. Instead, after a few minutes, he simply asked, "Do you need help untying that?" I was initially a bit shocked and embarrassed, but he was very nice and not creepy. It is just the culture there. Story 24. Two come to mind as an American. 1. I was in New York City a week after September 11th. Everyone in the city was so kind. The normal New York City bravado was gone. It was unsettling. 6 months later, returning to Queens, I was told to go away several times. That's the New York City I know. 2. Visiting Ecuador for the first time was wonderful. It is a beautiful country, and I love it like crazy. Like many places in the world, its modern sanitation has not reached the point where you can flush toilet paper, so it is disposed of separately. Took some getting used to. Story 25. Costa Rica. After our group trip, I was trying to get the address of our guide so I could send him some items from Canada. When I asked him for his address, he started to describe how to get to his house. I stopped him and said, "No, just your address so I can send a package to you." He laughed, nodded, and once again began to describe how to get to his house. I said, "I don't need to know how to get there. Just give me the house number and street so I can send you something." That is when he explained that this is how you write an address when sending things in his area of Costa Rica. 3 houses down from the Blue Hotel, the one with the big tree in the yard and red trim, was his address. Story 26. My family is from Louisiana, and I spent all my summers in Baton Rouge. While I knew my great-grandparents in Thibodaux spoke French when they were alive, I had never heard a single person in Baton Rouge speak French. It absolutely was not a thing. As a teenager, I went fishing at Grand Isle and Foreshon down on the coast, and sure enough, everyone in the bait shops and on the beach was speaking French. It was a surreal moment, feeling like a foreigner in your own country. Story 27. I remember going back to the United States for the first time after moving to England a few years earlier and having to cover my ears because everyone was so loud. I felt like everybody was yelling at me. I knew Americans were considered loud, but it was overwhelming. Story 28. Sweden. I am from Iceland, and this cashless society is strange. I asked a friend when we walked in front of a beggar, how is he begging when no one uses cash? You just use Venmo or Apple Pay through his phone. Story 29. My aunt is American, and she and my uncle used to live in Kentucky. We visited them there when I was a child. My family and I were living in Lesotho, Africa at the time. My mother always tells the story of when they went grocery shopping in an American mall for the first time. She separated from my father so he could get cereal. She later found him in the cereal aisle having a full meltdown because there were too many cereal options, and he just wanted some regular cornflakes. The excess of America continued to be a source of stress for my Zimbabwean father for the rest of the trip. Story 30. Working in Norway. On the surface, such as during holidays or in cities, it does not seem very different from other Western first world countries. In reality, it is somewhat isolated and rural. There is also a lovely but challenging ambition to be both a compassionate and individualistic society at the same time, and these two goals often clash. The only thing that creates a culture shock is that these differences are unexpected. I have worked in many countries and am used to bracing for culture shock. However, when you think of Norway and perhaps other Scandinavian or Northern European countries as being enlightened and accessible to people like me, the differences that arise can be genuinely shocking in a way that cultural differences in a country like Vietnam are not. Story 31. Amsterdam, as someone who is often absorbed in their own world, I was not expecting to be stressed by the bicycles. They were everywhere, going in every direction, and I felt like a rude tourist when I ended up in their way. It turns out my ideal pedestrianized city is one where people stick to walking. Story 32. Went to New York City and I was surprised at how nice everyone was. I grew up in the southern United States and we were always told that New Yorkers were rude and unkind. I went in expecting that, but as long as you don't slow someone down, they are nice. Relatively impatient but nice. Story 33. I went to a public pool in Iceland, and I knew it was customary to be naked in the showers and changing rooms. What caught me off guard was the dad coming into the common showers with his two little daughters, also naked, while I was showering there. I mean, if the mom did not go to the pool with them, it makes sense that he takes his kids with him, but still, I did not expect that at all. Story 34. As a Canadian driving down to Florida with my father in my early 20s to visit my snowbird grandparents at the time, I found the many religious billboards to be really strange and disturbing, along with so many radio stations broadcasting evangelical and gospel preaching. It really creeped me out for some reason. I have seen a couple of billboards here in southern Ontario, especially in recent years, but back in the early 2000s, I had not experienced anything like it. I grew up Catholic and attended Catholic school too, so I thought I would be used to having religion imposed on me, but I guess I was not. It really creeped me out for some reason and definitely felt like culture shock. Story 35. I moved to the United States from Canada 2 years ago. I was surprised by the selection of food in the grocery store. There are foods and products that I would have to go to specialty stores to find in Canada. I lived in Toronto, so you would think there would be room in the Loblaws at Maple Leaf Gardens for a can of hominy. Unfortunately, the grocery industry in Canada is dominated by two companies, and they are remarkably small-minded. The same goes for liquor. The Liquor Control Board of Ontario has a stranglehold on alcoholic beverages in Ontario, and you cannot get anything but the most expensive liquor, beer, and wine. Specialties like lambics or kirsch are nowhere to be found. It is also strange that you can buy liquor right in the grocery store in the United States and do not have to visit a separate vendor. Story 36. I am American living in New Zealand. These people do not have good pickles. I mean, good pickles just are not a thing in this country. They only have very sugary, sweet pickles. Story 37. I've lived all over the world and experienced different forms of culture shock. In the Czech Republic, it took 6 months to realize it was a country of extreme introverts. I wasn't making friends with locals because they all had 2 or 3 people they considered friends, and that was enough. They were all full up. In China, I was shocked by how physical you had to be to exist. Waiting in line, people would try to push in front of you, and you had to shoulder them back or you would never get anywhere. Physically pushing people and being pushed was common. One of the biggest culture shocks I had as an Australian was when I moved to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was different from Australia in subtle ways that were often surprising. I often felt rude just being myself. For instance, I went to a friend's birthday party at a pub, and the bartender offered the birthday girl a shot. She hesitated about what she wanted, and then another Australian and I shouted, "Tequila!" By their facial expressions, you would have thought we told the group, all British, to get lost. Everyone in the United Kingdom uses a bucket to wash dishes, rather than just doing it directly in the sink. The bucket goes into the sink, and then you wash the dishes in the sink bucket. I think it just felt more proper. People were chatty, but mostly talked about the weather. For some reason, the subtle differences were much more challenging than the big differences of other places I've lived. Also, the food was bad. Story 38. I did a lot of parkour camps in my early 20s. I was always shocked at the sheer culture clash I had with the Americans. There was absolutely zero common ground on basically everything, even though I was British. I didn't dislike them, but by the end of the camp, I was hanging out with the Nordic people over the Americans because I just got on better with them. As strange as it sounds, I was quite disappointed. It basically killed my desire to go there. Not long after, I moved to Switzerland, where I integrated almost immediately. I was very sad to leave. Story 39. I went to a place called Barrow-in-Furness. It is only a 3-hour drive from me in northern England, but it felt like another world. Bleak and run down, you could sense dread in the air. The absolutely gigantic Devonshire Hall factory building, where they manufacture nuclear submarines, dominates the skyline. Almost futuristically dystopian and like going back in time simultaneously. A deeply odd place. Story 40. Maybe not the biggest, but definitely one that stuck with me. I am from India and studied at an American university for my bachelor's degree. After completing my course, I went to Belgium for my master's degree. What really stood out to me was how people would openly and loudly cough, sniffle, blow their noses, and generally make the typical sounds associated with having a cold in the middle of lectures. I have seen professors pause lectures to wait for a student to finish their sneezing fit. The first few times this happened, I was shocked. In my 22 years of life, I had never seen classrooms this accommodating for the mildly ill. In India, I was kicked out of a class for coughing too much. What made this behavior in the Belgian university so strange was that they were not accommodating in any other way. I received dirty looks from the same professors when I asked if I could translate the headings of their formula sheets from Dutch to English for my exam. Story 41. I spent 9 months traveling Central and South America. I got locked down in Colombia when the coronavirus pandemic hit and had to take a United States Embassy chartered flight, spending an overnight transfer in Fort Lauderdale. I was not prepared for how unfriendly it was to pedestrians. Everything was designed for cars. Even walking from the hotel to the restaurant across the road was oppressive. I accept that I was only there for a night and did not get to see much, but I never saw anywhere I would want to spend time and exist. It contrasted greatly with my 9 months of traveling, where I loved to walk random streets to experience the culture. The United States had no culture. It felt soulless. I was not ready for that. Story 42. As an Australian, I had been living in Spain for about 9 months and thought I was familiar with most aspects of the culture. Then came Easter and the Semana Santa religious parades with people wearing robes and pointed cap-pirate hats. I was completely unprepared and lacked context. Besides being a very unfamiliar scene, I also wondered if they were somehow predecessors of Ku Klux Klan hats and robes. Story 43. Early in my travel career, I landed in Europe for the first time on a red-eye flight, ate mushrooms to stay awake, and walked into a Zwarte Piet parade with blackface clowns throwing gingerbread cookies around in Amsterdam. Story 44. United States, coming from Europe. I had heard stories about fake American smiles. I saw exactly one person like that during a months-long trip. Everyone else was super nice, friendly, and genuinely curious. Then again, I skipped big cities and mostly traveled around the South. Airbnb hosts gave random gifts such as wine bottles and homemade dinners with barbecue. Just wow. I have traveled a lot, but Americans are some of the friendliest. Story 45. I'm Norwegian and went to England for a holiday. The size of the servings of wine amazed me. The glasses were huge. I was very happy, of course, but on the first day I had plans after lunch, and one glass of wine had me half drunk at noon. Story 46. I am from Japan but have been living in Western Europe for a few years now. A few years ago, I went to the United States of America for a business trip. I thought I was accustomed to big differences, but I was still very confused in the United States of America. I know people are supposed to tip, but I had no idea who to tip and how much. I was also not used to waiters coming by every minute and informally asking if we needed anything. It was hard to keep a conversation with another Japanese coworker when the waiter came by so often. Seeing posters around saying "no guns allowed," we stayed inside a hotel attached to a mall, was also quite strange. I am a picky eater and had some trouble liking most food. I don't really like bread, dough, or sweet things. Story 47. Cincinnati. I was stranded there from 1995 to 2003. They still had Ku Klux Klan marches downtown. In high school, there was a place called Scarlet Oaks where they sent girls who got pregnant. Every stereotype about the South that I never actually experienced in the South was true in Cincinnati. There was blatant racism and bizarre, antiquated ignorance in a place where people thought of themselves as cosmopolitan. I wouldn't go back for anything. Story 48. Going to England as an Irish person is not a world apart culturally, but subtle differences surprised me. Story 49. In America, I noticed they add sales tax at the point of sale. I found that surprising. I am Australian, and we include tax in the product price. Story 50. I thought that the United Kingdom and the United States of America were really similar culturally, but they are not, especially in a working environment. The passive aggressiveness is real because what is considered rude is very different. Instead of your colleague just telling you, "Hey, XYZ isn't really working. Can you improve it?" You'll get polite feedback like, "XYZ is very nice. Do you have any thoughts on improving it, or should we present it?" What they really mean is that XYZ is poor quality and should not be presented, and you should know this. What are you doing? The first scenario would be considered rude for being so direct, whereas an American would consider it helpful and not rude. There is much more polite phrasing to your face without addressing issues directly, so you remain unaware of your true performance. Also, people mostly do not talk about things like salary, which is also considered rude. I think that explains a lot about why the same job in the United Kingdom pays about a third of what it would in the United States, even though the cost of living is generally higher in the United Kingdom. The only person whose salary I know is Australian, even though last week I had a conversation with a British colleague about salaries, discussing what they are and how no one knows. In the end, we did not reveal our salaries to each other. This is a very British-type conversation, talking around the issue but not revealing it. Lastly, their talking patterns are distinctly different. A British person has a much longer pause between words when talking. In a conversation, an American might wrongly assume they have finished speaking and reply, whereas the British person now feels they have been rudely interrupted and thinks the American is rude. The American has no idea the British person is now upset. Not that they would tell you they are upset, as that would be rude. Took me a while to adapt. Story 51. Coming back to the United States after being in the Peace Corps, my mom picked me up from John F. Kennedy International Airport. Having been away from the United States for 2 years, I had forgotten how large a quarter acre was when we turned into the neighborhood I grew up in. Story 52. Easy 1. In Canada, we always lined up at the bar to get our drinks, but rushed the doors to get on the bus. In Ireland, it was completely the opposite. Just line up for a drink. Christ, that made me mad. Story 53. I understand that when I crossed the border into Germany, many places still insist on cash payments more often than expected. In contrast, I can pay by card or transaction applications almost everywhere in Switzerland nowadays. Story 54. I lived in South Korea for a few years, and there were many culture shocks. One of the biggest was the trash and recycling system. Every type of plastic has to be sorted into the correct bin, and you must buy trash bags for food waste and regular household waste from your local grocery or convenience store because they must be specific to your neighborhood. Usually, the trash and recycling sorting takes place in a designated area of the parking lot or a small side room in your apartment building. If you make a mistake, you may be lectured by your neighbors. Story 55. Germany. I have been living in the Balkans for a while now, and landing at Munich airport felt like being transported to a completely different world. Compared to Albania, it felt sterile and almost like a hospital with how quiet and blank it was, in contrast to the barely contained chaos of Albania. If I had flown there after living in the United States instead, it would have felt completely normal. Story 56. I am Canadian. When I go to the United States, I find it odd that even in big cities at restaurants, they do not have a card reader that the server brings to you. Instead, they take your credit card to the back and you manually write the amount of tip on a piece of paper rather than just selecting a percentage on the card reader. Story 57. Washington, D.C. I'm from the Midwest, and D.C. is just so different. My friend moved there from Oregon and said his time in China was easier to adapt to and less of a culture shock. I made it less than a year in DC before moving back to the Midwest. If I have to live in a place 4 years before it feels like home, I'm out. There are so many people, roads are packed, it takes forever to get around, and it's very insular. Not to mention, expensive with many employers unwilling to pay living wages. My pay was the same in DC and the Midwest, but I had 30% more spending power moving back, and my quality of life was much greater. I do miss some things from DC, but the Midwest is home. Story 58. It always amazes me when I visit New York City and see young children navigating busy streets completely alone. Last time, a 10-year-old was walking briskly through the Upper East Side as if late for a meeting. I also saw an 8-year-old in a very busy part of Queens heading home from a convenience store. Chicago is a big city, but those kids are quite different. Story 59. I was queuing up in a shop waiting to pay, and I turned around and saw a civilian carrying a firearm on his hip, standing right behind me, looking at me. Guess the country. Story 60. Going to a public sauna with my German girlfriend in Germany. 10 years later, I still cannot erase the image of a woman cleaning herself with a soapy finger. Story 61. Definitely the United States of America. I spent a month there with a week each in Florida, Miami and Orlando. In Las Vegas, loathed it. In San Francisco, had some European vibes. And in Hawaii, people were nicest here. I then went back a few years later and spent a week in New York. On my first visit, I was shocked at how many people were beyond overweight and how loud people in general were on every possible occasion. Eating in restaurants was a sensory nightmare every single time. Just the volume of the food and how normal it was to be served portions so ludicrously huge, and the cacophony going on in the background. And the nasal accents. Yes, I am aware that accents vary, but they all have something in common that British accents, also wildly varying, do not. This felt much more acute in real life than how the accent is spoken in movies or television series. Also, the sheer number of obviously homeless people and beggars in a country purported to be wealthy. Human beings who clearly had not seen a meal in days, while morbidly obese people walked past them as though they were invisible. I know I did not see any of this fully, as I was a tourist visiting touristy places, so the vast majority is likely different. On my second visit, I was there for work. I did not hate New York, but again, the same thing about people being loud mostly applied. Story 62. Going to America and seeing dedicated liquor stores with signs everywhere saying no identification, no alcohol. I was especially taken aback walking into a Circle K in New Orleans and seeing signs saying that if you look under 40 you will get asked for identification. I come from the United Kingdom where the drinking age is 18 and I very rarely get asked for identification. Story 63. United States. Expected smiley. Have a nice day, etc. No, they were rude and miserable, especially at the airport. The only friendly people we encountered were in Memphis. Story 64. I moved from Pilot Mountain, North Carolina, to Fernandina Beach, Florida. I am used to people being respectful and friendly. People wave at strangers as they drive past, get along, and help each other out. This place is very rude. Everyone is for themselves in Florida, and they do not respond kindly if you say hello to someone. Do not get me started on the crime in Jacksonville. Every single day there are drive-by shootings. I moved here because of my husband's job but cannot wait to leave. Story 65. I'm Canadian and moved to England about 10 years ago. I was expecting culture shocks, but the biggest surprise for me was my lack of knowledge of British pop culture from the 1980s and 1990s, which made it difficult to understand jokes or many references from people my own age. It seems obvious, but I had never considered the awkwardness of everyone sharing a pop culture bubble that I had no nostalgia for, and how much of the media we consume as children and teenagers can still affect the way we speak as adults. It doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, I just nod along. My husband has been very supportive in helping me fill in the gaps and understand some of the references over the years. Being on TikTok in the United Kingdom helps a lot too. Story 66. In America, how's it going? Or how are you? Is a casual greeting that does not really require a truthful or in-depth response. In Germany, I asked a coworker, how's it going? and received a detailed description of their mother's battle with cancer and its emotional and financial toll on the family. It is not that I did not care or resented them for sharing all that. I was just taken aback because it was 7 in the morning on a Monday. Story 67. Going to America and being asked for a higher price at the counter than the total of what I had bought. I initially thought they were trying to scam me. There have been many other instances, but that was one situation I did not expect. Story 68. I moved to Scotland from Australia as a child, and the culture shock was how generally unhappy and unsmiling people looked when out and about. People did not walk around looking happy or jovial as they did back home. Here, the clouds, gray skies, and cold seemed to make smiling the exception and a resting angry face the norm. When the sunlight comes out, the entire population transforms and becomes kinder and happier. Story 69. England. My parents are English. I was born in New Zealand and have dual citizenship. It took going to the United Kingdom to realize how much growing up in New Zealand has shaped me. Despite ancestry going back there for hundreds of years until it can't be determined, before records were kept and citizenship, I am not English. That was a complete culture shock for me. After emigrating as 10-pound pommies, originally to Sydney, then later to Wellington, my grandfather died from an industrial incident, leaving the family in a poor state. Grief, depression, no family support, inequality of women's wages, lost the house, and so on. On my mother's side, there was a really idealized view of England before the Troubles began. That is what I grew up hearing. This view was not shared by my father, who left in his 20s and met my mother here. She understood his accent. But he did not really talk about England at all until his later years. So it was really built up too much and never stood a chance of living up to expectations. Story 70. South Korea has mall-style shopping that opens after supper and continues until almost sunrise. My Korean friends can function on zero sleep if they get enough food. In the Philippines, I saw older, broke North American and European men with young Filipino women. Some of the young women I talked to appeared older than their actual age because wrinkles are not common for them. I am sure some of these relationships were mutually beneficial, but many involved underage girls and boys. It was hard to hide my disgust at the tourists. Everyone acts like it is acceptable. Sug. Story 71. Iceland was very hungover one day, and finding a good greasy hamburger was much harder than expected. I did not know why, but I just assumed hamburgers were a staple everywhere. Story 72. Home. After living in Japan for a year, coming back to California was shocking. I got used to walking. I had not seen an obese person in months. My need for personal space grew. Driving was a burden. Food was not as good. The general expectation of safety vanished. I go back at least once a year, and I wish I could combine the best of both countries. Story 73. Moving from Seattle to Chicago. Someone asked me how we grew blackberries, obviously assuming they were deliberately planted and not the invasive weed that Rubus discolor actually is. We don't. We fight a valiant but ultimately doomed battle to keep them from taking over the property. Story 74. I went to rehabilitation in the same state where I am from, and there was a girl who came from Canada. I told the one Canadian joke I know, which everyone always finds funny. I even learned it from a Canadian, so I did not think anything of it. However, this girl got very offended. Story 75. I spent 3 months in London and loved it. I had to return to the United States. The noise level in the United States hit me like a physical assault when I got back. We are loud as a culture. Story 76. In Mexico, the waiter will not bring the bill until you ask for it. This caused a few long dinners at first. Story 77. I thought there were many homosexual men in Istanbul, which was surprising. However, I was told that men just hold hands there, and it is considered normal. That was also surprising. Story 78. Turkey is a land of contrasts. They have bidets on every toilet, which is great. Yet, in rural areas, on some boats, in universities, and even in the airport, there are squat toilets with holes in the ground, reminiscent of the year 1500. Additionally, public drinking, such as on the sidewalk or in parks, is legal. Story 79. Every time I go back to my home country, I noticed several differences. I have lived in Europe for about a decade, and I am from an Asian country. The crowd, the lack of order in traffic, the way people ask personal questions directly, and the lack of personal space stand out to me. Story 80. Coming back to Canada to visit after spending years in Spain, I experienced a kind of reverse culture shock. It was quite depressing to see how much it resembled the way I described the United States to my friends here. The empty streets and parks, the angry and aggressive people, the need for a car to get anywhere, and shopping areas organized by districts that required a car to reach. The advertising everywhere. This is southwestern Ontario. I am not sure if the rest of Canada has become like this, or if Ontario has always been this way and I just adjusted to the Spanish lifestyle, but it was still quite a shock. Story 81. Visited family in Birmingham from Ireland in the 1990s. I had never seen a non-white person in my life as an 11-year-old, and Birmingham was very diverse. Made friends with a nice Sikh boy. Story 82. I am from Canada and went to Israel for a month to meet my partner's family around 2011. It was a huge culture shock seeing soldiers walking around with large guns and having to put my purse through airport-style scanners at movie theaters and malls. I also had to go through metal detectors at tourist sites. Story 83. Several posters have mentioned things in Japan, and I have a new observation to add: the uniformity of hair color. Other than tourists, expatriates, older people, or those who dyed their hair, everyone has black hair. Coming from the United States, it caught me by surprise, since I am used to seeing a full spectrum of hair colors. Story 84. I am Canadian, and when I visited Australia, I was surprised to hear the local first-generation Chinese population speaking English with an Australian accent instead of a Canadian one. It made perfect sense, but it was something I had never considered before. Story 85. I, a generic white, blonde, blue-eyed male of average to short height, was routinely mistaken for Icelandic when visiting Iceland. I am from the United States, so much so that when disembarking from the plane after landing, I was ushered to the European Union and Iceland passport line. I guess it was not a culture shock as many Icelanders share my features, but it still made me laugh. Story 86. Last year I went to Morocco on a religious holiday, the birthday of Prophet Muhammad, and I was surprised to see many families having picnics on the streets and on the grass at sunset. The men were on one side, and the women were on the opposite side. Hearing the mosque's call to prayer in person is a unique experience. I have been to Europe twice, visiting Portugal, Spain, and Italy. I was surprised I did not see many stray dogs, and even if there were some, it was not a lot compared to the number of stray dogs in my country. I was also surprised at how pedestrian-friendly the driving culture is, at least in Spain. We did not have to wait for drivers to stop and let us cross at the pedestrian crossing because they know they have to stop. Story 87. Canadian here. Went to Texas and expected the cowboy hats, the multi-lane highways, the vast suburbs, the gigantic sodas. Was shocked by open carry. It is one thing to know that they like their guns. It is another to see people wandering around with the capacity to, with very little effort, end your life. I was very happy to leave. Story 88. Montreal, Canada often seems similar to the United States, but staying in downtown Montreal was jarring. Between the older architecture and prominent French language, it was almost like being in Europe in some ways, but familiar in others. Story 89. In the United States, I was actually shocked at just how puritanical people were. Alcohol and gambling were viewed as societal evils, whereas guns were seen as a necessity. Coming from Ireland, I found this really puzzling. But the most frightening thing was the level of religious worship and outright Bible bashing I encountered while there. Compare this to Ireland, where religion and the church are seen as almost relics of the past, especially in the South. Granted, we still have a number of legacy areas like school patronage where the church retains greatly diminished influence, but aside from that, religion is all but irrelevant to many Irish people. Story 90. Kazakhstan. Although I am aware it was part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, I thought as a Muslim-majority country, people would be a bit modest in the sauna. I was wrong. Almost everyone is completely naked there. Story 91. American traveling with my same-sex spouse in Canada. I had not realized how accustomed we had become to explaining our relationship when making reservations and obtaining services. I was genuinely startled when my spouse rented a car and asked if I would be allowed to drive it. And the clerk said, "Of course, you are spouses." Story 92. It was a little rough for me in Spain when I had to endure the siesta. I was always starving and couldn't wait to eat dinner at 8 p.m., which is too late for me. At that time, I would much rather have preferred an appetizer or a snack. I was lucky to find a few kind-hearted people who still had their bar or restaurant open when everything else was closed for hours. One Romanian lady took care of my cousin and me. She made us calamari, gambas al ajillo, and a nice salad. She didn't have to go out of her way to do that, but it was really sweet of her. I definitely gave her a good tip, and she was grateful. There was also a Chinese restaurant that stayed open a little longer, so I was able to get a late lunch and eat it as an early dinner. Otherwise, everything else about my trip to Spain was fantastic, except for a creepy-looking old lady who came out of nowhere with an injured eye. She grabbed my hand and said I would have bad luck because I didn't give her €5. She caught me off guard. She looked like the lady from the movie Drag Me to Hell. Story 93. Actually, I have had it a few times already, but coming back home is different. Especially some years ago, when using the internet in other countries was very expensive. Coming back home and having it all at your fingertips was an odd feeling. Story 94. My family and I went on vacation to the southern United States. We are from New England and they bagged our groceries in plastic bags. Plastic bags have been banned in New England for a few years now, so it was shocking to see. There were other cultural differences, but those were expected. Story 95. American in Lisbon, Portugal. Lovely country and culture. After 2 weeks, the lack of smiling a lot was noticeable. People are relaxed and more reserved than in the United States. It is not a bad thing, just different and noticeable. When I flew back to the Atlanta, Georgia airport, people were smiling a lot like Americans do. I had never realized it before. I am not a big smiler or overly smiley. It is definitely just a cultural difference I would not have noticed if I had not traveled. I am glad I did and learned so much. Story 96. Egypt. Cairo had the worst traffic ever. Driving is absolute madness. People walk in every direction as cars maneuver past donkey carts. Sometimes you see animals being bled out on the street. It is wild. Story 97. America has enormous portion sizes. For the land of the free, it is strange that I was not free to cross the road where I liked. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.